This is Devastator, the Constructicon combiner from Transformers Revenge of the Fallen. When Industrial Light and Magic took on the task of bringing him to life, they were not just building another Transformer, they were creating the most complex CGI model they've ever attempted up to that point. For reference, in the first Transformers movie, Optimus Prime's CGI model was already a technical marvel, made up of 10,108 meticulously crafted parts. Yet Devastator would surpass that complexity by an astonishing margin. His CGI model? It consisted up of a staggering 52,632 parts, more than 5 times the intricacy of Optimus Prime. Now, such an ambitious feat did not happen overnight. It started with a bold vision, one that would go on to redefine what Michael Bay's Transformers universe would ultimately become. This is the making of Michael Bay's Devastator.
You ever see that film Gunfight at OK Corral? No, why? We're right in the middle of it.
So how did the idea to include Devastator in the film even come about? Well, during the pre-production for Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, director Michael Bay envisioned expanding the Transformers universe in every possible way. He wanted to showcase characters as small as a molecule, to characters as tall as a skyscraper. His goal was to make audiences feel like this universe had limitless possibilities, with Transformers coming in all shapes, sizes, and forms. Hasbro played a key role in helping bringing that vision to life, since when Bay shared his idea of introducing a combiner in the second film, Hasbro suggested one of the most iconic combiners from their lore, Devastator. And luckily for Bay and the team, they already had a blueprint to bring Devastator to life in live action. You see, long before Revenge of the Fallen was officially greenlit, Hasbro began collaborating with Massive Black, a concept art company that had previously worked with them on the first Transformers film. This time, Hasbro specifically tasked Massive Black with exploring ideas that they had for new characters that could appear in a potential sequel. This ensured that Hasbro had a solid foundation of concepts ready to pitch to Paramount when the second film went into production, and they were doing this as early as January 9th, 2006. Among their early concepts were characters like Soundwave, Jetfire, and Ravage, fan favorites who would later play significant roles in Revenge of the Fallen. But one of their most ambitious designs was for Devastator. Their early artwork captured the essence of what Devastator could be in live action, showcasing his immense size, intricate details, and raw destructive power. Massive Black envisioned him as a combiner made from 5 vehicles, each piece contributing to his monstrous form. His body was made up of a Hitachi EH5000AC dump truck, adding a sense of bulk and stability. His right arm and back were formed by a Hitachi EX5500 hydraulic shovel, giving this version of Devi claw-like appendages. However, the vehicle chosen to form his left arm was quite an interesting choice, since it was a Volvo FB2800C timber harvester, making it the first non-construction vehicle to be part of Devastator. This unconventional trend continued with his lower body, where his left foot was formed by a Caterpillar M105 deployable universal combat earthmover, and his right foot was spawned from a Caterpillar D9R armored bulldozer. While this design served as a groundbreaking starting point, it was not the only concept art Massive Black created for Devastator, since the team later developed another concept, refining their initial ideas and experimenting with alternate features and proportions to make him look more like his Generation 1 counterpart. However, it was the original design that would ultimately become the foundation for what Devastator would be on screen, as seen in this concept art from around November 6, 2007. And in it we can see Devastator squaring off against Optimus Prime, who is powered up with a trailer upgrade. Now, you might be wondering how we transitioned from this early design to the monstrous version that made it into the final film. Well, unfortunately, we don't exactly know how far this design progressed in development. However, what we do know is that the art director for the film, Ben Proctor, would go on to make a concept for Devastator on November 16, 2007. This version marked a significant departure from the earlier design. According to the notes included with the concept, it was labeled as a study of 7 combined Constructicons, suggesting that the focus had shifted towards including more individual vehicles into Devastator's composition. This decision may have stemmed from the desire to showcase more unique Constructicons in the film, giving each of them their moment to shine before combining into Devastator. By increasing the number of vehicles involved, the filmmakers could further emphasize the sheer scale and complexity of the character, aligning with Michael Bay's vision of pushing the boundaries of what a Transformer could be on screen. And while this concept represented the next evolution of Devastator's design, it was still far from the version that ultimately appeared in the film. The next iteration, conceptualized around January 3, 2008, introduced key design elements that would serve as the foundation for the Devastator we would eventually see on screen. This new iteration came with a significant shift in his overall design philosophy. Devastator was reimagined with a hunched-over posture, which was described by Ben Proctor as Devastator's destruction mode. In this version, Devastator was given a gaping mouth-like structure that houses a newly conceptualized vortex grinder, a massive spinning mechanism designed to consume everything in its path. This terrifying addition emphasized Devastator's destructive capabilities, solidifying him as a walking weapon of mass chaos. Compared to his earlier designs, which emphasized a more humanoid stance, this version leaned heavily into an alien-like animalistic appearance. We would also get some concept art depicting him standing upright, showcasing an alternative approach to his posture and presence. This version leaned more into a humanoid silhouette, reminiscent of his earlier designs, while still incorporating the chaotic and mechanical elements introduced in his destruction mode. Interestingly enough, this concept took some inspiration from the Generation 1 Devastator design, particularly with its use of green accents. Here we can see where Devastator's green eyes originated from, as well as the idea of his mouth being illuminated with a vibrant green glow. What's particularly notable about this concept is how it carried forward the philosophy of Devastator being composed of 7 distinct construction vehicles. However, it appears that they were still determining where these vehicles would form up on his body and what vehicles they would be. Now, if you have a keen eye, you will immediately know that in this iteration of Devastator, we can clearly see Long Haul and Scavenger for the first time as part of the combined mode. This is because full robot mode concepts for Long Haul and Scavenger were finalized months before this Devastator concept was made, allowing Proctor to experiment on how they would be incorporated into Devastator's composition. You see, Long Haul's robot mode design was actually the first concept art approved for Revenge of the Fallen, and the story behind why is pretty cool. You see, Josh Nizzi, a lifelong Transformers fan and freelance artist, was amazed by the Transformers 2007 movie and wanted to work on its sequel. Recognizing the challenge of getting hired onto the project, Nizzi devised a bold plan. He anticipated that Devastator would appear in the next film, so he designed one of his components, Long Haul, as a Caterpillar 797 dump truck. He posted his artwork online, where it quickly gained recognition and praise from fans. A few months later, Aaron Archer, Hasbro's design director for Boys Toys, reached out to him with an opportunity to work on Revenge of the Fallen. Shortly afterward, Michael Bay's studio, Bay Films, hired him to work on-site and remotely. What's remarkable is that Long Haul's robot mode design, which Nizzi had created independently before being hired, became the first concept art approved for the sequel on October 22, 2007. Scavenger, on the other hand, would be approved a little over a month later on November 26, 2007. And the story behind him is equally as fascinating. You see, for the second film, Michael Bay was really pushing for unique and unconventional robot anatomies. Inspired by this direction, Ben Proctor designed Scavenger, who was at the time called a Wheelbot, off of the O&K RH400 mining excavator. The initial sketch only had one wheel, but Michael Bay wanted the character to have 2 so the robot could do an end-over-end bashing motion as it rolled, thus giving us the Scavenger that we all know and love. Now, one last thing I would like to point out with this iteration of Devastator's design is this concept with the vehicles listed on the bottom. As we know, we can see the 2 that represent Long Haul and Scavenger, but we can also see a bulldozer and a wheel loader. This is significant because the bulldozer appears to be an early version of Skipjack's combined mode. Interestingly enough, a concept for Skipjack's robot mode was created by Ryan Maynarding just a day before this Devastator concept, which potentially indicates that the development of his individual design was closely tied to refining the overall composition of Devastator's combined mode. And something very interesting about this concept art for Skipjack is that he was depicted as being massive. I mean, absolutely massive based on the size of that truck. And thanks to this very early Decepticon scale chart, he was intended to be 35 feet tall, and would have transformed into a Komatsu D575A-3 bulldozer. As for the wheel loader, on the other hand, it clearly represents an early version of Scrapper's combined mode. Now, unfortunately, we don't have access to any concepts of Scrapper's individual design, or what would become him from January 2008. However, what we do have access to is this piece of concept art from February 7, 2008, of a Volvo wheel loader Constructicon that was intended to be a nurse character. Interestingly, the nurse concept has Hightower's head, but shares the exact same chest design and similar arms to Scrapper's final concept art. This strongly suggests that the nurse design evolved into Scrapper, indicating that Scrapper's individual robot mode concept that would serve to be a basis for his CGI model was likely created sometime in February 2008. Now, as for whether the motor scraper, excavator, and the crane had corresponding robot mode designs, this is unfortunately unknown to us. However, it is highly likely. The reason I believe this is because it's impossible to determine if every concept we have access to online represents the entirety of what was created behind the scenes. So it's possible that robot mode designs for these vehicles were explored but never made their way online. And so, with the groundwork for Devastator's combined mode taking shape, the design team tackled more individual Constructicon designs to further refine and expand the composition. On January 2, 2008, concept artist Steve Jung introduced two fascinating Constructicon concepts. These early designs are marked as rough form studies and showcase an experimental approach to robot anatomy. The first concept was based on a material handler. This bot featured a unique spindly frame with long articulated arms ending in claw-like appendages designed for grasping and lifting. The other concept was based off of a walk wheel trencher, and this robot's design was more imposing, since it had a massive circular saw integrated into its chest, giving it a distinct and intimidating presence. Around a week later, on January 10th, Steve Jung would create another robot, this time based off of a Kobelco CK2500 truss crane. Jung would design two iterations, one of which looked like a T-Rex, since the boom formed the tail and the treads became massive feet. The second iteration, however, leaned into a more monstrous design by giving the robot actual arms, one of which equipped with a massive wrecking ball. However, in the end, the truss crane Rex design would ultimately become Hightower in the final film. Now, the same day Hightower was conceptualized, Ben Proctor designed a robot based off of a cement mixer. And the coolest thing about this robot is that the cement drum turned into shields that the robot could use. Now, as we all know, this design would eventually evolve into Mixmaster. But at this point in development, he was actually planned to be an Autobot. And we know this thanks to this old Autobot scale chart where we can see him ironically chilling next to Jetfire. What's particularly interesting about Mixmaster's early design is the face study Proctor created for him, which gave him a friendly, approachable appearance that was inspired by actor Brendan Gleeson. Now, something that is pretty interesting about Mixmaster's color scheme here is that in Proctor's original Devastator study, the left leg was made out of a white cement mixer with a green stripe. Whether or not this color choice was intentional is unknown, but it's a pretty cool Easter egg regardless. Now, just 4 days later, on January 14th, 2008, Ryan Maynarding introduced a new Constructicon concept, the Trencher Bot. This design was based off of a Trencor mechanical trencher, and boy does it look sick. But by far the most striking elements were the enormous circular saw integrated directly into its body and the tank-like treads that formed his arms. So with all that said, up to this point in time, these are all the publicly available pieces of Constructicon concept art that I know to have been created before the next publicly known iteration of Devastator emerged. And when this concept dropped on January 15th, 2008, we saw Devastator take a giant leap towards the version we would eventually see in the final film. Now, you might be wondering what caused this giant leap in design philosophy from his previous iteration, and well, thanks to Ryan Maynarding, we have an official answer. According to him, the idea of the center vortex in the body was already established when he was working on a slightly animalistic take on Sideways when he was still meant to be a Lamborghini. They asked him to apply that design's posture to Devastator, thus resulting in this iteration. And I gotta say, I love what he did here. The idea of Devastator being hunched over due to how top-heavy he is something I always liked about his design. Now, something we should definitely touch on is the vehicles that form up Devastator in this iteration. Here, we can see what appears to be the first time Scavenger was conceptualized to be the torso of Devastator, and this works a lot better than him being an arm or a leg, since his vehicle is the biggest out of the bunch, so making him the body of Devastator was a no-brainer. Another Constructicon that got carried over to form Devastator in this iteration was Hightower, since we can see him clearly make up Devastator's left arm. However, he isn't the only Constructicon that makes up the arm, since we can clearly see a second pair of treads from another construction vehicle that forms Devastator's left hand. But that's not all, since a third Constructicon is present. If you look right above Hightower, we can see a tire from another construction vehicle, potentially from either the Material Handler Constructicon or the Rock Wheel Trencher Constructicon, thus putting the amount of Constructicons that form up Devastator's left arm to 3. However, on the other hand, pun intended, Devastator's right arm only appears to be made out of 2 Constructicons, based on the fact that we can see a tire and a tread. The tread appears to be part of a bulldozer based on this bucket that we can see. As for who this bulldozer could be, it's potentially Skipjack. However, it is unclear what vehicle this big tire is supposed to be from. However, my best guess would be is that it's from the Motor Scraper Constructicon. Now, if we move on to Devastator's legs, on his left one we can see that it's made out of 2 Constructicons. The first one is likely Scrapper, since we can see the tire and the teeth from the scoop of a front-end loader. But as for the other vehicle, the only thing that we know about it is that it has treads, which might potentially come from the Mechanical Trencher Constructicon. Now, if we move on to the right leg, this is where things get a bit tricky, since it only appears that 1 Constructicon makes up this leg, and it clearly transforms into a caterpillar vehicle that has treads. The only candidate that we know about that would fit this bill is Skipjack, meaning that in this iteration of Devastator, Skipjack was either meant to make up the right leg all by himself, or he would have combined with another Constructicon to form the right arm. Unfortunately, we have no concept art publicly available on what the other character who was not meant to be Skipjack would have looked like. And speaking about concept art that we don't have access to, the head of Devastator is a prime example, since it appears to be made out of a white dump truck with the numbers 841. This means that either Long Haul was going to be recolored white and would have turned into a different vehicle in order to form the head of Devastator, or another dump truck Constructicon would have turned into the head, omitting Long Haul from the combination entirely, which is pretty freaking interesting. Now, the same day this concept was made by Ryan Maynarding, he would make another one to show off how Devastator's vortex grinder would work. And here we can see the whole idea of how Devastator going on 4s in order to suck up everything was created. And interestingly enough, we can see 2 little arms that come out of Devastator's head in order to support himself when he is eating, which is something that would make it into the final film but would look different. Now, what stands out the most to me about this concept is that Maynarding decided to change a handful of Devastator's components for this concept. For starters, Long Haul appears to be added into the composition of Devastator, forming the entirety of the right leg. The left leg, on the other hand, has been changed, since Scrapper is no longer a part of it based on the fact that his scoop has been swapped out for treads. Lastly, Devastator's right arm no longer appears to be formed from 2 Constructicons, since the tire that we saw before is no longer present. As for why these changes were made is unknown. However, 2 days later on January 18th, 2008, Maynarding would redefine his Devastator concept, reverting mostly to the old layout Devastator had before. However, now, Devi had a lot more detail added to him. In this concept, his head is starting to look a lot more like his final design, with the neck now having the vortex grinder detail as a part of it, as well as his face having a lot more angular pieces and the addition of 10 eyes. As for Devastator's arms, they are mostly the same, but now they have a lot more armor. On Devastator's right arm, the bulldozer bucket that we saw has now been split and is overlapping each other. However, we can still see the tread and the tire from the 2 Constructicons that form up this arm. The same cannot be said for the vehicle parts on the left arm, since almost all of the treads are covered up, but you can still see them through the extra panels. However, the tire that was on the upper arm is now mostly covered up, to the point that it now might just be a robotic part rather than a vehicle one. Whether or not this is telling us that this Constructicon was removed from Devastator's composition is unknown. However, we do know for a fact that Scrapper was removed from the composition, since on Devi's left leg, we can no longer see his scoop because it was replaced with a pair of treads. But oddly enough, we can still see Scrapper's tire, which is likely a mistake, since this would mean that 3 boss would form up Devastator's left leg. As for the right one, everything appears to be the same. The only change is that more detail has been added to fill out the leg. Now, after this iteration of Devastator, the final known concept iteration of him would be made around 5 months later on June 2nd, 2008. But before we go on and talk about it, I want to discuss all the ideas and concepts that got created during this period. The first concept that sprung up was on January 21st, 2008. That depicted a backstudy of Devastator, and this is the earliest known concept that we have that shows off Devastator and the massive hole in his back. It's also very cool to see that they envisioned him having these massive claws that appear to be made out of scoops. Interestingly enough, it mentions that the rear view needed to be updated to reflect the front view. Moving on to February 7th, 2008, the concept of the Nurse Constructicon that eventually evolved into Scrapper would be made. However, another Constructicon that was created during this period was Scrap Metal, who was based off of a Volvo EC700C crawler excavator, and was conceptualized by Paul Osimo on what appears to be February 11th, 2008. Unfortunately, I cannot confirm the date because the notes section is so small. However, something I would like to point out about scrap metal is the design of his left arm, since it would go on to be used for Scrapper's right arm, which basically tells us that scrap metal was an early iteration of Scrapper. Now, from here on some unknown date, we would get another concept of how Devastator's vortex grinder would work, and interestingly enough, he would no longer have the green glow in his mouth or the little arms that came out of it. Here, Devastator was depicted using his hands in order to support himself when he was eating, which is a change that would make its way to the final film. Moving on, a face study of Skipjack was made by Josh Nizzi, Tony Kimmey, and Ryan Maynarding on March 18, 2008. And something pretty cool about it is that he has a Decepticon logo on his head, which is something that never made it into the final film. Now, at some unknown date leading up to Devastator's final known concept iteration, the decision was made to turn Mixmaster from an Autobot to a Decepticon, and they would decide to turn him into the head of Devastator. Now, to my knowledge, it has never been stated why this change was made, but thanks to this piece of concept art, we can see what is likely the first time they decided to make Mixmaster a part of Devastator, since we can still see parts from the white dump truck present. With that said, this now takes us to the last known concept art that would be created before Devastator's final known concept art iteration. That of course would be for the Constructicon based off of a Komatsu HD465. This robot would eventually go on to become Overload, and he was conceptualized by Ben Proctor, sometime before July 2nd, 2008. Proctor would go on to redefine Overload's design, coming up with two distinct designs for him, one that had 2 legs and the other that had 4, and this design right here is definitely my favorite iteration of Overload. Unfortunately, the bipedal design would be the one that would go on to become his official robot mode. However, something interesting about this concept art lies in the notes included with the design. Despite being based off a Komatsu HD465, the note suggested an idea of keeping the belly dump trailer, but potentially switching out the tractor for a Caterpillar 773B or a similar model. As for why this idea was considered is unknown, but they would actually go on to replace the HD465 for a 773B as the tractor of Overload for the final film. And so with all that said, that takes us to June 2nd, 2008, where the final iteration of Devastator in concept art form that we have access to was created. This particular piece of artwork was made by Ryan Maynarding, Ben Proctor, and Paige Buckner. And as we can see, this is very close to the final design that we see in the film. Thanks to this piece of concept art, we know that at this point in time, they settled on Devastator being made out of a total of 7 Constructicons. Starting off with Scavenger, who is still referred to as Wheelbot at this point in time, was envisioned to be the torso of Devastator. However, something interesting is that in the notes, it talks about how they were still debating his final paint scheme, and that his vehicle mode would be made out of CGI for the film, which makes sense since getting a real RH400 on location would be pretty hard to do. Another thing that I find interesting is that they were discussing if he would appear in robot mode during the Egypt scenes. However, unfortunately, Scavenger doesn't appear in robot mode at any point during the film. However, Demolisher, who is identical in every way, besides the fact that he transforms into a Terex RH400 mining excavator, which is identical to the ONK RH400 mining excavator, but rebranded in Terex's corporate colors after they acquired Orenstein and Koppel, does make an appearance in the film. Now, something you might be wondering is why Demolisher is even in the film if the filmmakers already had Scavenger. And well, based on everything that we know, I believe the reason lies in the decision to make Scavenger a member of Devastator. You see, when Scavenger was first drafted up, Michael Bay wanted Ben Proctor to give him 2 wheels, so he would have the ability to bash things as he rolled around, thus birthing this concept art of him going down the street, which eventually evolved into an animatic. And according to pre-visualization supervisor Steve Yamamoto, the shot of Scavenger demolishing the overpass set up the scale and tone for the movie. Now, at the end of this animatic, Scavenger is taken out by Optimus Prime and Ironhide, meaning that Scavenger was always intended to die after this awesome action sequence. However, for one reason or another, the filmmakers decided to make Scavenger a part of Devastator. This meant that his death in this sequence would create a massive continuity error, since they needed Scavenger to still be alive later in the film as a component of Devastator. And so, in order to address this, the filmmakers duplicated Scavenger's design and introduced Demolisher. By doing this, they could retain the iconic action sequence without jeopardizing Scavenger's role in forming Devastator. Now, you would think that the whole idea of taking one character and slightly altering them to create another character, allowing the original to become a part of Devastator, would only be something that would have happened once. But surprisingly, it happened again. You see, Skipjack, who at this point was called Jumping Jack, was conceptualized before being made a part of Devastator. and was intended to have an epic fight scene with Bumblebee. However, according to Steve Yamamoto, the fight presented a significant visual issue. Both Skipjack and Bumblebee were yellow, making it a little hard to distinguish between the two. To address this, the filmmakers introduced Rampage, who is basically a red version of Skipjack. While it is unknown if the color issue was the definitive reason for creating Rampage, it seems highly likely given the circumstances. This adjustment not only resolved the potential visual confusion with Bumblebee, but also allowed the filmmakers to reuse the same robot design. With that said, if we circle back to this piece of concept art and take a look at Mixmaster, we can see that his vehicle mode, the Mack Granite GU713 cement truck, is the only one out of all the construction vehicles that was meant to be product placement, which is quite surprising. Another thing that you will notice is that Mixmaster's robot mode still has his original head and Autobot color scheme. This is because his Decepticon head and color scheme wouldn't be finalized by Ben Proctor until June 23, 2008. Another thing that is interesting here is that this part from the white dump truck is still present, which is really odd due to how big it is. Luckily, this would be omitted for the CGI model. With that said, let's move on to Overload. And as you guys can see, they were still working on what his robot mode would be, and were debating whether or not it would appear in the film. Unfortunately, it never did, and it's a real damn shame, since in my opinion, it's the most badass out of all of them. Another thing about Overload that we should talk about is that they decided that he would form the rear torso of Devastator. And I always found this to be interesting, since the massive scavenger alone was always intended to form the entire body originally. And realistically, I think it could, so I always felt that Overload's inclusion was a little redundant, especially since he has the same color scheme as Scavenger, making it impossible to determine where he is on Devastator. But regardless, I'm happy that he's a part of the team. With that said, let's take a look at Hightower, and he has a few interesting notes to go over. The main one is that the concept art states that he has no robot mode. Now, what I assume this is referring to is that the filmmakers decided that Hightower's robot mode would not make an appearance in the film, which is a real shame since I would have loved to see the Truss Crane Rex in action. And to this day, we still don't know why they made this decision. However, another decision they made based on this chart was that Hightower's vehicle mode would be made out of CGI. However, interestingly enough, they would decide to walk back this decision, since the Kobelco CK2500 was on set, and they even gave it a Decepticon logo. Now, the last thing I want to mention about Hightower here is the fact that he now makes up the entire left arm all by himself. But despite this, on the left hand, these buckets are present that don't exist anywhere on Hightower's crane, which is a very weird oddity. And speaking of oddities, if we take a good look at Skipjack, despite him making up the left leg all by himself, the artist still left in the third tread from the previous iteration, as well as the tire, thus explaining the origin of where the third tread came from. I can only assume the reason why they chose to keep it was because it complemented Longhaul's tires, which are integrated into the right knee joint, and so they wanted something to be integrated into the left knee joint so it would match the right one. However, this is just my theory on why this very strange oddity happened. With that said, let's take a look at Longhaul, who was referred to as Big Green. And here we can see that the filmmakers decided to put him right back into Devastator's combined mode as the right leg. Now, something I do like to point out is that Longhaul's vehicle mode has been changed. You see, originally when Josh Nizzi conceptualized him, Hall was intended to be a massive Caterpillar 797 dump truck. However, during production, his vehicle mode would be changed to a much smaller Caterpillar 773B. While there is no official explanation as to why this change was made, my best guess is that just like in the case of the RH400, getting a massive vehicle like the 797 on set would be quite the challenge. And on top of that, they would need to paint the entire thing green. And so I believe they changed the Longhaul into a 773B since it would save on cost and be easier to acquire and transport to the set. Now, this vehicle mode change would actually end up causing a CGI error. Since Longhaul was envisioned to be a 797, he had its dump bed pattern on his arms. However, for some reason or another, the concept artist would never update Longhaul's robot mode in order to give him the 773B's dump bed pattern. This led to his robot mode CGI model to have the dump bed pattern of the 797 and not the 773B. Funnily enough, the only Longhaul CGI model that had the correct dump pattern would be the vehicle model that transforms in front of Leo and Simmons. And so, with all that dump bed talk out of the way, let's move on to Scrapper. And here in the notes we can see that they were still determining if he would appear in Egypt or not. and luckily for us he did, since he would get a small action scene in the film. Now, the very last thing with this Devastator concept art that I want to focus on is that despite several Caterpillar logos being on Devastator's concept art, as well as the concept art for some of the Constructicons, in the film no cat logos appear on Devastator, or any of his components that turn into Caterpillar vehicles. As for why this was done is unknown, but I think it might have been something to do with licensing. Here are all the changes that were made. Overload's cat logos were painted over with a white stripe, and his model number 773B would be replaced with J605 on the left side, while the right side would be given a Decepticon logo. Longhaul, on the other hand, would get his cat logos painted over with a black stripe, and his model number 773B would be replaced with L250 on the right side, while the left side would be given a Decepticon logo. Payload, who is a character we will dive into later in the video, would also be given this treatment. His Caterpillar logos would be painted over with a black stripe, and would be given a Decepticon logo on top. His model number 773B would be replaced with a black stripe on the left side, while the right side would be replaced with some sort of number. Unfortunately, we can't make it out on this image, but it was likely L250. Rampage, Skipjack, and Buckethead, who is another character we will talk about later, all transformed into Cat D9Ls, and that model number designation would be replaced with M930. Their cat logos, on the other hand, would be replaced with a black stripe with a Decepticon logo on top. Lastly, this leaves us with Scrapper, who would get his cat logos on the back sides of his vehicle mode painted over with a black stripe, and his model number 992D would be replaced with B430. The cat logos above his cab would be replaced with B430, as well as the one on the back of his vehicle. With that said, this makes Mixmaster, Scavenger, Demolisher, Scrap Metal, and Hightower the only ones in the film to keep their logos of their vehicle's manufacturer, which is pretty freaking interesting to me. And so yeah, that's basically everything to say about this piece of Devastator's concept art, which was quite a lot. The only thing I haven't touched on yet is the day after this concept art was created, it would be used in a clarification chart for Hasbro, so they would know what robots united to form Devastator. And this chart explains why for the longest time, Hasbro claimed that Devastator was made out of 7 Constructicons, since at the time this was the only thing they had access to in order to make the toys. And so with all that groundwork laid out for you guys, it's finally time to talk about how ILM brought Devastator to life. Now, transforming him from a 2D concept into a fully realized jaw-dropping 3D model was no small feat. You might assume the process was straightforward. Take the approved concept art and translate it directly into a CGI model. But that couldn't be farther from the truth. You see, in order to bring Devastator to life, ILM had to create highly detailed digital replicas of the vehicles that made up his massive form. And this wasn't just about modeling their external appearance, it was about constructing digital replicas that could fully replicate every mechanical detail of the real-world machines. And this level of precision wasn't optional, it was mandatory, since when Devastator starts to combine, the vehicles themselves must move, shift, and transform in ways that the real-life props simply couldn't. So ILM had to digitally build every vehicle from the ground up, ensuring they could simulate the complex motions required for the combination sequence. Take Scavenger for example. His enormous ONK RH400 mining excavator had to be modeled down to its 8-foot-tall scoop. Every rivet, dent, and scratch had to be painstakingly recreated to ensure authenticity when the camera zoomed in close, and this level of detail extended to all the other vehicles as well. And as if creating these incredibly detailed vehicle models wasn't challenging enough, ILM also had to construct fully realized robot modes for the Constructicons, since many of their robotic parts would ultimately integrate into Devastator's combined form. And so, with the vehicle and robot modes fully built, ILM was finally ready to tackle the colossal task of constructing Devastator. To bring his massive and intricate form to life, ILM turned to a technique known as kit bashing. Much like traditional model shops, where builders combine parts from existing kits to create something entirely new, ILM's team adapted this concept for the digital realm. Over the course of the production, they built an expansive parts library filled with meticulously crafted mechanical components, rivets, gears, pistons, panels, you name it. These weren't just generic pieces, they were pulled directly from the detailed vehicle and robot models ILM had already created for the film. Approximately 40% of Devastator's massive frame was built using these pre-textured and pre-painted library assets. This asset library saved the team countless hours, allowing them to focus on creating new, specialized pieces to complete his monstrous form. And when they were finally finished, ILM had crafted the largest and most intricate CGI model they ever created for the Transformers franchise. Yet despite the monumental effort that had gone into constructing Devastator, ILM's job was far from over. Since when the team presented the completed model to director Michael Bay, his reaction was less than enthusiastic. He famously remarked, it almost looks like a toy." Now, Bay's reaction wasn't just about being overly critical. It reflected his deep understanding of the demands of IMAX filmmaking. Devastator was set to appear on screens as tall as 6 stories, and every detail on him would be magnified. Any flat or simplistic areas on the model would shatter the illusion of realism, and Bay simply wasn't willing to compromise, thus forcing ILM to go back to the drawing board in order to figure out how they could elevate Devastator to meet Bay's expectations. Now, you might be wondering what the original Devastator model looked like. And well, if you're a Transformers fan, you actually have already seen it countless times. The promo render of Devastator that was used on almost all of his merchandise and marketing material is the original Devastator model. And I know this because on a very old archive of Josh Nizzi's website, we can see photos of this render with the caption, "Marketing images based on ILM work in progress models." Now, looking at this render, it's fascinating to compare it to the original concept art, because to me at least, the render is less detailed than the artwork. Most notably the hands. If we take a look at Hightower in the concept art, the fingers on his arm mode are made out of these buckets that in reality shouldn't even exist, since those parts aren't found on a real Kobelco crane. However, despite their inclusion in the concept art, the modelers decided not to carry over this design detail. Instead, they opted to give Hightower completely different fingers, which in all honesty works a lot better, since these new fingers actually look like they're made out of crane parts. Now, what makes this decision particularly interesting to me is how it relates to the standard practices at ILM. When I interviewed Sean Stevenson, a former ILM 3D modeler who created the CGI models for Sentinel Prime and Topspin, he told me that the modelers have to follow what is in the approved concept art to a T. However, there have been exceptions to this practice. For instance, according to Josh Nizzi, when he created the concept art for Megatron in Dark of the Moon, the chains wrapped around Megatron's body were not part of his original design. Those chains were added later. Personally, I believe this was not something the modelers would have added on a whim. The most likely explanation is that the chains were either added based on a piece of concept art that Nizzi did not know about, or they were added by the modeler when they were explicitly instructed to do so, either by the studio or Bay himself. However, the only person who would know the definitive answer is Rene Garcia, the 3D modeler responsible for creating the final Dark of the Moon Megatron design. So with that said, if we circle back to Hightower, it's likely that the new finger design was either based on a piece of concept art that we don't have access to, or was a specific directive from Bay or the studio. This explanation could also explain the other discrepancies between the original concept art and this Devastator model, such as the O&K logos being replaced with RH400, these white parts from Scavenger being switched to yellow, Scrapper's fingers having a different design than the one shown in the concept art, and just a handful of other things. So with that said, it's no wonder why Bay wasn't satisfied with this initial model. His expectations for Devastator weren't just high, they were sky high, driven by the unique demands of IMAX filmmaking. Thus, ILM was sent back to the drawing board, tasked with reworking Devastator to meet these new extraordinarily high standards. And this rework wasn't just a simple touch-up. It required a complete overhaul of detail, scale, and texture to ensure Devastator could stand up to the scrutiny of IMAX. Taking Bay's feedback to heart, the team meticulously added tiny hoses, wires, ladders, and countless other intricate details to emphasize Devastator's immense size to the audience. In doing so, they effectively doubled his part count, transforming him not only into the largest model ever created for the Transformers films, but also the largest and most intricate model in ILM's entire history. And they would go on to receive a Guinness World Record for this achievement. Devastator's final part count reached an astonishing 52,632 parts that were made out of a staggering 11,716,127 polygons, which is over 5 times the complexity of Optimus Prime's model from the first film. Now, to put that number into perspective, if you put all of Devastator's parts stacked lengthwise, they'd reach 73,090 feet or 13.84 miles, which is roughly the height of 58 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. Another cool comparison is that if you took all the gold ever mined in human history, it would only fill up half of Devastator. Now, among the many additions to Devastator's design that contributed to his increased complexity was of course the infamous enemy scrotum, and I'll let Bay explain how that particular idea came into play.
Simmons is under he says, I'm under the robot scrotum.
Yeah.
I want to do a shot where he looks up when he's trying to know where we are, and I want two, what are those construction wrecking balls kind of hanging a little bit. I'm dead serious. Like a crane thing and then like another wrecking ball, kind of just clink. That's some funny laugh.
Now, another thing that would be added to Devastator during this phase was some weapon systems. Scavenger would provide the missile batteries on Devastator's shoulders. Longhaul would provide a minigun for Devastator's right leg. Skipjack would provide a dual turret on Devastator's left leg. Hightower would provide a minigun and a missile launcher for Devastator's left arm. And lastly, Scrapper would provide a dual turret and dual missile pods for Devastator's right arm. Additionally, both Scrapper and Hightower would equip Devastator with grappling hooks, further enhancing his destructive capabilities. Now, as we know, one of the most significant factors influencing Devastator's complexity was the decision to film most of his scenes in IMAX. The larger frame offered the ILM team both new opportunities and substantial challenges. Unlike the traditional 35mm format, IMAX provided a much taller and wider frame, giving the team far more space to fill with visual detail, allowing them to not always have to fit Devastator into a rectangle because now they had this giant square to work with. However, this freedom came with a catch. Every inch of that IMAX frame needed to hold up under intense scrutiny. To put it in perspective, while a standard 2K frame might have been sufficient for most films, IMAX required 4K resolution. While that might sound like double the detail, it's actually 8 times the resolution of a traditional frame. Every component of Devastator had to look flawless when projected onto a 6-story tall screen, which is why they had to add so much detail to ensure that every part of Devastator looked alive and functional, even in extreme close-ups. However, all those thousands of intricate details were only part of the challenge. They also needed to be textured with the same level of precision and realism in order to meet the demands of IMAX, a task that would push ILM's view painters to their absolute limits. You see, ILM's view painters generated a staggering 6,467 texture maps for Devastator alone. This took up a total of 32 gigabytes of storage, and to handle the complexity, the team used 2K textures as the baseline. This was because 4K textures would significantly slow down rendering times. However, if a part of the model did not hold up with 2K textures, they would go on to upgrade it to 4K. This balancing act of resolution ensured that every part of Devastator looked breathtaking, whether the camera was zoomed in on his hand or pulling back to capture his towering form. And so, with Devastator's model fully constructed and textured to IMAX level perfection, the next monumental task was to bring him to life. A task that would go on to be as daunting as building him, if not more so. His sheer complexity pushed ILM's technology to its absolute limits. You see, when the animators first attempted to load Devastator's model into ILM's proprietary software, the results were catastrophic. In one incident, an animator loaded the entire model all at once, only for the computer to freeze completely before suffering a full-scale meltdown. When the IT team investigated, they discovered that the motherboard was dead, the hard drive had failed, and the memory was fried. However, this wasn't the only computer casualty, since in another incident, when an animator attempted to load Devastator's model in high resolution, their computer grinded to a halt and began to smoke before ultimately shutting down for good. While it was unclear to the team if the smoke was directly caused by Devastator, the timing left little room for doubt, earning Devastator the reputation as a system killer. To prevent further disasters, the team had to rethink their approach. Devastator was so massive and intricate that treating him as a single asset was simply impossible for their systems to handle. Instead, they broke him down into 6 separate assets. This modular approach allowed the animators to work with smaller, more manageable pieces of his model, which mirrored his composition as a combiner made up of individual construction vehicles. However, even with this approach, animating Devastator with his high-resolution textures remained a significant challenge. To manage the complexity, the team developed a set of tools dubbed Mr. Potato Head buttons that allowed animators to dynamically adjust the resolution of Devastator's individual components when animating him. This system was instrumental in speeding up the time it took to animate Devastator. However, rendering him introduced an entirely new level of difficulty for the ILM team. You see, his immense size, intricate design, and high-resolution details demanded extraordinary computational power. Individual frames were so complex that, if rendered on a single processor, they could take up to 72 hours to complete. To overcome this, ILM utilized multi-processor setups, often employing 26 processors to chew through the work faster. ILM would go on record to say that no digital character in the history of film had ever required as much computing power strength to render than Devastator. Now, one of the most demanding sequences involving Devastator, both visually and technically, was the moment where he opens his massive cement mixer mouth to create a vortex in order to suck up all the sand, trucks, and debris. To achieve this effect, ILM used a combination of simulations and innovative techniques to bring the chaos to life. Rather than directly running a complex particle simulation every time they needed to make adjustments, something that would take an entire night to compute, ILM's team started by using a simpler, faster simulation as a guide. They created a cone-shaped structure that connected Devastator's mouth to the ground and ran a cloth simulation on this cone. The cloth simulation, which mimicked fluttering and movement, allowed the team to quickly adjust the overall flow and get approval for the general motion in under an hour. Once they were happy with the movement, they layered the particle simulation over the cone. And this is where things got even more advanced. Because this scene was going to be shown in IMAX at a massive 4K resolution, they had to ensure that every grain of sand and cloud of dust looked realistic. To do this, they used a process called volumetric rendering. Instead of treating the dust and debris as individual particles, they simulated it as a 3D grid filled with tiny cells. Each cell contained data about how much dust it held and in which direction it was moving. To make the simulation even more detailed, they divided each grid cell into smaller and smaller sections, increasing the resolution. This also added realistic noise to the movement, based on scientific research about how turbulent air flows, creating natural-looking swirls and eddies in the dust. This method allowed ILM to create a dense, fluid, and realistic vortex that looked stunning even on the towering IMAX screen. The final rendering process for this 400-frame shot was so complex that it would have taken 3 years to complete on a single top-of-the-line PC in 2009. Thankfully, ILM used powerful multi-processor machines to significantly speed up the process. But as impressive as the vortex scene was, it wasn't the largest or most complex simulation ILM tackled for Devastator. That title belongs to the sequence where Devastator climbs the Great Pyramid of Giza and tears apart its peak, searching for the Star Harvester hidden within. This scene wasn't just a cinematic spectacle, it was a groundbreaking achievement in visual effects. To bring this moment to life, ILM simulated the destruction of the pyramid's top, sending 122,000 individual bricks tumbling and crashing in all directions. This was no small feat. In fact, it became the largest rigid body dynamic simulation ever undertaken by ILM, surpassing their previous record by a staggering 8 times. To handle this unprecedented challenge, CG supervisor Christopher Horvath designed a custom rigid body dynamics engine with the help of ILM's research and development team. The engine leveraged NVIDIA's GPUs to run thousands of computational streams simultaneously, allowing it to calculate the movement and interaction of thousands of individual objects over time. This innovative system was the key to simulating the chaotic, realistic destruction as Devastator tore through the pyramid. And to add to the sense of realism, Devastator's immense power was emphasized in the physics of the scene. When Devastator's hand punches the pyramid, it's traveling at 390 miles per hour, demonstrating the sheer force behind his destructive capabilities. Every falling brick, every tumbling stone was meticulously crafted to convey the scale and devastation Devastator was capable of. It took 7 whole months to calculate the intricate movements and collisions of the blocks. Now, while ILM's groundbreaking digital simulations and digital artistry brought Devastator to life, their work would have not been possible without the spectacular on-location footage captured during filming. One of the most striking examples of this collaboration between practical and digital effects was Devastator's combination scene. For this shot, the filmmakers gathered all the real-world vehicles that assembled into Devastator, besides Scavenger, as obtaining a massive O&K RH400 mining excavator for an on-location shoot would have been nearly impossible. However, this absence turned out to be a creative advantage. Scavenger, as the largest and most central component of Devastator, became the perfect digital centerpiece for the combination sequence. By keeping him entirely digital, ILM seized the opportunity to craft his transformation as the driving force behind Devastator's assembly. Now, if you have a keen eye, you might have noticed 3 additional construction vehicles that combine into Devastator that were not a part of his final known concept art. The first one being a Payload, who is the yellow 773B dump truck that appears next to Skipjack. The second one being Scrap Metal, who is the Volvo EC700C crawler excavator that appears right next to Hightower. And lastly, Buckethead, the D9L bulldozer with a shovel attachment that was digitally added into the scene by ILM. Now, the exact reason why these guys were included to be a part of Devastator is something that has never been officially explained. However, I have a pretty good theory on why they were added. As we know, ILM needed to rework Devastator's design to meet the towering expectations set by IMAX and the demands of Michael Bay. This overhaul basically doubled Devastator's part count, and one of the new things that was modeled onto Devastator was a new left hand that was based off of the original hand that he had from his concept art. Now, this new hand posed a significant continuity problem. The fingers were made out of buckets that did not originate from a Kobelco crane. And so if viewers saw these parts appearing out of Hightower, it would break the illusion of these vehicles physically combining with one another to form Devastator. And so I believe that ILM decided to digitally add in this construction vehicle, equipped with the necessary buckets, to seamlessly integrate into Devastator's transformation sequence. And the funny thing is that the bulldozer you see is just the CGI model of Skipjack's vehicle mode, modified with the bucket fingers from Devastator's left hand. Now, unfortunately, this bulldozer never got any official figures from Hasbro, let alone given an official name, which is why 7 years ago, which is crazy to think about, I decided to give this character the placeholder name of Buckethead. The name originated from the female Micromaster Constructicon of the same name, and to my surprise, the fandom embraced it, with some fans creating custom versions of the character to make their Studio Series Devastator more screen accurate. Hopefully one day Hasbro will make an official figure of Buckethead, since we still have no idea what her robot mode is supposed to look like. So with Buckethead squared off, you now might be wondering how Scrap Metal got included into the formation of Devastator. And well, I believe it also harkens back to ILM reworking Devastator's model. You see, while ILM created tons of new parts for Devi, such as all the red panels all over his face, his 4 highly pronounced horns, and all the throat gears that make up his vortex grinder, not every single piece was exactly new. You see, when Scrapper combines into Devastator, the model number on his vehicle can be clearly seen right under Devastator's right armpit. In reality, there should only be one of these since there's only one Scrapper. However, ILM took this part and flipped it to bulk out the right armpit of Devastator. This technique of copying and pasting assets would happen again with one of Hightower's treads, since we can see this tread positioned right behind Hightower's. Now, I personally believe that just like in the case of Buckethead's creation, ILM needed some sort of justification to make these parts feel intentional within the context of the film. And this is where Scrap Metal comes into play. During the production of the movie, a Volvo EC700C crawler excavator was outfitted with a Stanley UP45SV universal processor attachment and adorned with Decepticon logos to become Scrap Metal for the scene aboard the Bayos cargo ship. At the time Scrap Metal's vehicle was being dressed up, it's unlikely that he was officially designated as a part of Devastator. However, I suspect that once news of the extra tread in Devastator's model reached the production team, they saw an opportunity to incorporate the Volvo excavator into Devastator's combination sequence, which explains why Scrap Metal appears next to Hightower. With that said, this leaves Payload, who is by far the odd one out, since he wasn't a CGI creation and his vehicle was not used prior to this, which implies that he was always intended to be featured in the combination scene. However, what throws a wrench into this is that no identifiable parts from his vehicle mode make it onto Devastator. So then, what's the story behind Payload's inclusion? Well, based on everything that we know, here's my best guess. As we know, during production, Longhaul was originally envisioned to transform into a Cat 797, a massive dump truck that is significantly larger than his final alt mode, the Cat 773B. Now, based on everything that we know, this seems to be a change that was made late into production, since a Longhaul CGI model still has the Cat 797's dump bed pattern. But that's not all. Since in this shot of the film with all the CGI vehicles, we can see that Longhaul is significantly bigger than Rampage in vehicle mode, and later his robot mode reflects this with him towering over Rampage. Now you might just say, well, that is how big the 773B is compared to the D9L. However, it's not, and we know this since when we see Skipjack and Payload pull up, their vehicles are roughly the same size as each other. With that said, this leads me to believe that ILM, for some reason or another, decided to stick with Longhaul's original height when he was a 797, thus explaining why his vehicle mode is so big in this shot and why he towers over Rampage. Now, you might be wondering how this translates to Devastator, and well, here's where things get interesting. My theory is that when ILM modeled Devastator, they used Longhaul's original Cat 797 height for his right leg mode. This decision would have set the scale for Devastator's right leg. However, since Skipjack was a D9L bulldozer, the mass of his vehicle alone would have not been sufficient enough to match the size and bulk of Longhaul's. This discrepancy would have created an imbalance in Devastator's proportions. I believe that ILM recognized this issue during the rework of Devastator's design, and informed the production team about the need for additional mass to balance out the left leg. In response, the production team included Payload into the combination scene. By pairing his 773B dump truck with Skipjack's D9L bulldozer, it would provide enough mass to balance out Devastator's left leg. Now, I do want to reiterate again that this is just all a theory of mine, since it has never been officially explained why the filmmakers added Payload into the Devastator combination scene. And it is very strange that they did, since if you just took this scene at face value, knowing that Longhaul's onset 773B is around the same size as Skipjack's D9L, there is no discrepancy between the mass of the legs, thus making Payload's inclusion all the more puzzling. But another possible explanation I have for his addition into the scene is that the filmmakers wanted to enhance the visual impact of the combination scene. By adding another massive construction vehicle, the filmmakers could emphasize the overwhelming scale and complexity of Devastator's formation, ensuring it felt as epic as possible. As for why ILM never included any visible vehicle parts for him onto Devastator, it's possible that ILM had already locked in Devastator's design by the time Payload was added into the scene. With the tight deadlines they were already facing and the work required to rework Devastator's CGI model further, it's possible that incorporating Payload's elements wasn't feasible within the production schedule. Now, one of the reasons for these tight deadlines ILM faced was the challenge of ensuring that Devastator looked perfect in IMAX. You see, when Michael Bay shot the combination scene with IMAX cameras, they had a unique depth of field that kept everything in sharp focus. Even objects that were incredibly far away, such as the stone wall in the background, were incredibly clear. This clarity makes IMAX shots feel larger than life, but it also creates significant challenges when trying to incorporate massive CGI characters like Devastator. One major hurdle was capturing the sheer scale of Devastator's formation in a way that felt real to the audience. With Devastator towering over 100 feet tall, traditional filming techniques couldn't fully capture the scope of his presence. Helicopters couldn't even provide the necessary range of motion for shots, and cranes were limited in their movement. To overcome this, the team created a Digimat, which is a digitally stitched environment made from real photographs of the on-set location. This allowed ILM to construct a virtual world, where they could freely move the camera and frame Devastator's assembly from any angle. However, as Bay reviewed some of these Digimat shots, he noticed a glaring issue. Part of the background appeared blurry. In IMAX, this was a deal breaker. The crystal clear focus of an IMAX camera doesn't allow for such discrepancies, and the blurry elements clashed with the realism Bay was striving for. Despite the significant time and effort that had already gone into creating these virtual environments, Bay insisted that the blurry Digimats had to be scrapped entirely. ILM was forced to start over, rebuilding the Digimats from scratch to ensure they adhered to IMAX's strict visual standards. During filming, Bay's relentless pursuit of realism did not stop at reworking digital environments. When it came to capturing Devastator's ferocious appetite, Bay went all out with practical effects. To simulate the chaos of Devastator's destructive vortex, Bay brought in a Learjet engine mounted on a truck, capable of blasting winds up to 250 miles per hour. This jet engine, combined with industrial-sized fans, hurled barrels and debris across the set, creating an authentic sense of devastation. Raymond Rodriguez, who plays Leo Spitz in the film, endured grueling conditions during the Devastator vortex sequence. To simulate the chaos of Devastator's vortex, Bay had Rodriguez hold on to a pole while two industrial-sized fans blasted 100-mile-per-hour sand, soot, and dirt directly into his face. To add even more intensity, two crew members pulled onto cables attached to Rodriguez's ankles to mimic the force of being sucked up into Devastator's vortex. But Bay wasn't done there. He introduced hydraulic cranes to flip cars inches above Rodriguez's head. During one particularly intense take, the strain from the cables caused Rodriguez's shoulder to dislocate. Despite the injury, the cameras kept rolling, and the take where his shoulder popped out made it into the final cut of the film. Rodriguez later needed his eyes flushed out for 45 minutes due to the sand and debris. Another practical effect Bay employed was the destruction of the trailers during Devastator's chaotic rampage. To achieve this, the production team rigged the trailers with hundreds of individual ripping points. Each point was tied to cables, which were connected to larger cables timed to pull at different intervals. This intricate setup gave the trailers a realistic, progressive tearing effect, mimicking the sheer force of Devastator pulling them apart. And so, with a combination of groundbreaking CGI, practical effects, and sheer creative ambition, Devastator became a cinematic marvel. From the intricacies of his design to the chaos of his on-location filming, every aspect of his creation reflected the incredible effort of the filmmakers and ILM's team. Devastator wasn't just a villain, he was a technological and cinematic milestone that pushed the boundaries of CGI nearly to its breaking point. But while Devastator stood as the pinnacle of ILM's achievements at the time, he wouldn't hold the title of their largest CGI creation for long. That honor would later go to the Driller from Transformers Dark of the Moon, a colossal character that shattered records and redefined what ILM could achieve. But that story? Well, that's a tale for another video. Thanks for watching, and keep on theorizing.